Hi, Doug.
Hey, young lady. Hey, young lady.
Excellent. Well, we are live. We thank you as we continue along in our series of law enforcement and the African American lawyers section of the State Bar of Texas. We have started back in 2020 an opportunity to collaborate, to look for solutions, to talk through various issues and sometimes issues that our country have struggled with, to look for a better way to include community and to serve all populations here in the state of Texas. And hopefully these may be ideas and solutions that can serve other communities outside the state of Texas as well. We had wrapped up and somewhat concluded last week, as this is February 3rd, 2021, the duty to intervene. We'd like to get a summary of that. I'll pass the baton to Nikki on that. And then Governor Abbott, with the State of the State address this past week, spoke about one of the 5 issues that we had previously somewhat discussed about the funding of law enforcement resources. We'll get to the definition and defining that properly so that people understand what that means. And then if in fact that is something that is desired or would be the best thing in regards to law enforcement and community. So then now I turn it back over to Nikki. Thank you all for being here. Kevin, Clay, Doug, and Fred, we welcome him back. He's been on a very busy schedule, so we appreciate seeing him in this 2021 year. Nikki.
Thank you, Steve, and everyone, for happy Wednesday morning. Last week, we had a very good discussion on certain aspects of the George Floyd Act, and we talked about the qualified immunity issue, not just with within the state of Texas, but just in general, on how qualified immunity came to be, the process that would have to be undertaken in order to make any kind of real change or amendments to that, and just discussing what kind of amendments, what did we see with respect to those changes. And during that conversation, one of the things that came up in another aspect of the George Floyd Act is the duty to intervene. And so last year, or even before then really, but I think last year really came centerfold when you were looking at the video of what happened with George Floyd when the officer was there and their other officers were around him. And so there was a large outcry for there to be some type of charges, and they actually did get charged. And there is an outcry from the community, from many, from the legislatures, from just different individuals that believe that there should be some type of legislation enacted to ensure that when an officer is seen or appears to be committing a crime, that the other officers jump in and intervene. I'm kind of summarizing the language in the bill. It definitely is more in depth than that, and we've all had a chance to read it. But we wanted to just kind of quickly discuss that and what that looks like. I know here in Fort Worth, Texas, their internal policies do have the duty to intervene. But the problem is, as do, I'm pretty sure, a lot of other municipalities, law enforcement agencies have that duty to intervene within their internal policy. But I think the question comes up, or the problem arises, in trying to determine when that duty attaches. Because in order for a duty to attach, you have to have knowledge, you have to have an understanding. And a lot of the times when the officers, when there's an outcry for the duty to intervene, the defense is he wasn't committing a crime. He was acting within his lawful, acting within the purview of the internal policy or what a law enforcement officer is trained to do. And so I don't know to intervene, right? At what point would that duty attach? If we look at the George Floyd video, that's a great example. At what point in that situation would that duty to attach had occurred? And I think that's an important discussion because it is a problem. One that I think, like I said, a lot of internal policies have probably already addressed, but struggle with when that duty attaches.
And Nikki, I think the other thing is it's a case-by-case situation.
I completely agree.
What the determining factors are real time for law enforcement to make that assertion that now is the time.
Correct.
Anybody? Yeah, I was going to say anybody uh, from the law enforcement perspective. Again, we know there can be variations of theme. However, I think it's important to know, because I think some may think that that does not exist. One, I believe we've discussed that that's incorrect. And then two, the variation, there's 2,700 law enforcement agencies across the state of Texas. How does that play for the varying agencies statewide?
You're muted, Kevin.
So
There you go.
I think we need to clarify exactly what we're talking about, because these calls are not about creating a duty to intervene. We believe that a duty to intervene exists in a lot of different ways. These calls are to create a criminal penalty for a failure to intervene. And that's where it becomes extremely problematic. And as Nikki said, the devil's always in the details. When you start putting a legislative package together, when you start criminalizing failure to behave in a certain way, you have to be able to show intent. You have to show a culpable mental state. And, she also pointed out in the George Floyd case, all 4 officers had been charged criminally. One of them was standing there. He was not involved in the actual physical altercation at all, the use of force at all, but he's been charged criminally. Doesn't that show that at least somebody believes there is, in fact, a duty to intervene and a criminal penalty for failing to intervene?
I do want to, and that's a good point. I want to clarify one thing. From what I've heard, or in talking to some of the legislators that have talked about the duty to intervene, and I know there are several bills on that, which is interesting because there's more than one and they all have a different result. But some of them, I think, and that's where I guess the lawyer head comes out, is that you have to understand how to word it. Because I think in some cases they don't want a criminal penalty, but they want there to be a uniform policy in the government code for law enforcement agencies, so that there's some type of administrative culpability. Now, that's not all of them. Some of them, they do want a criminal penalty. So you're right. But I think what I would like to see, and what we've talked about, I know just in Fort Worth, Texas, is having some kind of accountability when you see something that has been proven, right? And so that's, again, when the duty attaches, when you knew or should have known that this wasn't right and you do nothing, and there's not really anything in the internal policies. There's a duty to intervene requirement, but there's no consequences in the duty to intervene requirement. So it's almost like fluff.
So Kevin, and Doug, and the question I was going to ask him, let me let you go, and then I'll see if I need to ask my question. Go ahead, Doug. Apologies.
Okay. Because
and thank you for saying happy birthday, my man. Appreciate you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Hey, well, that's one of the things you're looking at when you're talking about you're putting it into a law where there's a criminal penalty behind it. That's where the problem is going to come in, because the burden of proof is so much different there than it is for someone to be fired with a policy violation. So you've got to decide, is this something that you're looking at criminally, that there's going to be a punishment attached to it? Or is this something you want to standardize across the state that says, hey, this is something that you can fire someone for? And that way, that guy's not going to be a policeman if he violates that law or violates that rule. Versus, is there going to be a criminal penalty? Because then it becomes subjective
Right.
in a way that you cannot control.
So Doug, I think, and for those that may not know, for the Texas Senate, in a prior position, I was the committee director and general counsel for the Senate Committee on Criminal Justice. That's where Kevin and I first met 20 years ago. The scenario is, I may believe the product of repercussion may work best with an administrative that also can be looked at criminally. I think that may be something that most can get their hands and heads around, because it allows for agencies to act on their employee. And then if in fact, and I don't recall anyone objecting to the fact that if there are criminal acts that occur during an episode, that also can be pondered and then administered if in fact that would be the way to go. Administratively, you can have some uniformity across the state.
I think that's probably the standard we have right now. I don't know of an agency that doesn't already have a policy that says you can be disciplined for neglect of duty. And failing to intervene when a crime is being committed would in fact rise to the level of neglect of duty. Whether or not it rises to a criminal offense, like Steve said, that depends on the totality of the circumstances. That's a case-by-case decision to be made by a DA's office, by a grand jury, so on and so forth. Certainly officers have been, a la George Floyd, indicted for failing to intervene. It may not be titled that way. That may not be the criminal offense, but that is certainly what that fourth officer in Minneapolis is being charged with, is failing to do something to prevent that death.
Right.
And I think we could probably give you a list of cases where officers have also been criminally charged, where it is obvious that they had a duty to do something that they didn't do. Now,
and the policy, on the policy thing, Kevin, I would just add, we've all seen where, even in my agency, just recently had a trooper involved in a fatal shooting who was no billed because the shoot was justified, but he was dismissed for policy violation.
which happens all the time.
Yeah.
It's not uncommon for officers to be disciplined, even though there was no criminal charge brought, or the criminal case was in fact brought and later dismissed, or the officer was found not guilty, but they still wind up being terminated from their employment. And as Doug pointed out, it's a different standard. It's a preponderance of the evidence versus a proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
So a 50+1 versus 100%, just for those that may not have the levels of standard. Preponderance, clear and convincing in the middle, and then beyond a reasonable doubt. Well,
yeah,
I will say this.
I do think there's a very valid point, though, because there's 2,700 law enforcement agencies across the state of Texas. And, what is it, Fred, 1,500 of them employ fewer than 10 officers. There's hundreds and hundreds of agencies that have one single peace officer on their rosters. Having the same policies in place at all of those various agencies that's a tall order, that's a tall task. But we don't disagree that it's a worthy ambition.
Well,
And it could be something TCO can address too. TCO can address that through.
Right. Exactly. And again, I think as we've learned over the months that we have congregated and had these discussions, there's a huge disconnect between law enforcement and understanding what truly is available, what is set up, and where we realistically need to either repair or to insert ourselves to properly have I think there's a road there. There's just potholes. Some could be 2 feet. Some could be 6 or 7 inches worth of repair. But no one knows truly. I don't believe the extent of what's already there that you can move about with, and then what needs to be addressed. Because if you hit this pothole, your car's not coming out. If you hit this one, the shocks and everything take care of it. We keep moving. But we really don't necessarily, and that was not a sports analogy, we rarely know what this looks like. We don't know how far it goes. We don't know the extent. We've really only spoken about this in a truly meaningful way that would apply to all citizens in our state at this point. And that's kind of sad in a sense.
But I think that speaks to getting familiar with your local law enforcement community.
Absolutely.
I think that one of the things that would help, especially with transparency, is and I know that officers are busy, but maybe the community leaders that are out here, and hopefully some are watching, that are out, doing the outcry, that they would actually sit down with some of these officers and go over some of the policies that they have. That was the only way that I found out, because I wanted to make sure I was educated before I went and said something. And that's, you don't want to ever say something and you don't know what you're talking about. But you are correct. When you started looking in all of the policies, you see that there are things there. And so maybe starting there with the internal policies and having, like I said, some consistency and an understanding of what happens when something happens with an officer, that transparency. Maybe that's the officers being very, present in the community as a whole and speaking with their community, especially after something happens, because the media is going to really blow that up. And maybe having some kind of conversation on, with this is how we do this, or this is how the process works. There's going to be an investigation. This is how we do this if they're found to do this. But you never have any of that. It's just silent. And so you have the people that are protesting because they're upset, and then you have the officers that are having to defend their actions, and you never get that in between.
No, and you don't get information to the lawmakers that are introducing the pieces of legislation. Do they truly know that some of this stuff exists already? And you're like, well, and then you come up and you're, providing a resource witness and a capacity, and you're telling them, well, we already have this in statute. Did anybody check? No. Did anybody know before we wrote it up? Hopefully, and I'll tell you this from an internal perspective, legislative council, when they provide the bills and the updated and the new laws that people want to file, they are fairly forthright in saying this already exists, or maybe it exists here, but it doesn't exist there. Would you like to create some uniformity? And I think we can use the T. Cole sunset opportunity for uniformity, because I think if legislators know that there's some uniformity, because some represent parts of Houston, but some represent Alpine, and if you can get those law enforcement agencies all at least on some uniformity, at least in administrative policies, and then you leave the case-by-case episodes up to the criminal side, I think the community, the legislators, and law enforcement would now have a better way of understanding just how things are when you move through and an episode occurs. But we don't have that
I think I want to challenge something that Nikki and Steve have both said. We do have that. It does happen. And we can show you examples of where agencies, department heads have done a wonderful job after one of these incidents of coming out and being completely transparent, or as transparent as possible given the
But who knows that, Kevin? Who knows that?
I know. Right. What I'm saying is I think we have circumstances that we could use as examples that chiefs and sheriffs and city managers and mayors and county judges could use if they would pay attention. We had a case not too many years ago, I believe it was in Freeport, where there was an officer involved shooting that was contentious, let's put it that way. And the chief did a wonderful job of inviting the family of the individual who was shot to come in and view the body, even though he wasn't making it public. He invited the family to come in and see the videos of what had happened. Quanell X, who's a community leader in Houston, was invited to come down as well and view the video with the family. So the chief there, and I'm sure with the mayor's blessing and the city council's blessing, they were as transparent as they possibly could be. We've talked before in these conversations about, we believe there's too many times, and this isn't something that we as labor can fix. This is for administrations to do, for the elected officials to do. We believe that law enforcement does need to do a much better job of being transparent when these incidents occur. That there's this old mentality, and I think it comes from city attorneys and county attorneys. They tell them, circle the wagon. Look at there was a case in Chicago, I believe in 2015, where a young man was shot, and the city fought and fought and fought and fought not to release that video. Laquan McDonald was the young man that was shot. The city fought and fought and fought and fought to keep the video from being released. And once a court ordered the city to release the video, the officer was indicted and convicted and sent to prison. Now, I don't know that the officer had any say-so in whether or not that video was being released. It was the city that was opposing it so hard.
Right. Well, I think, again,
From a labor,
Go ahead. Go ahead, Doug.
From a labor standpoint, I'll tell you right now, I'd rather have the videos out there. If we've got a controversial shooting, put it out there. Good or bad, either way, it's going out at some point. I'd rather get it over and deal with it right up front than having this linger for months and months and months. And then we have 2 separate episodes.
Even though you will probably have to also explain, okay, the video doesn't show everything. There are other angles we need to look at. There's much more investigation we need to do, but here's what we do have at this moment. This is what we can show you. We are not going to, wrap this thing up in 4 or 5 hours based upon a video from one perspective that doesn't show us everything. We're going to do a complete investigation, and we will share that with you as we go along. That has got to be the way we approach these things.
So
But
Dan,
that's not the-
I think
that's not-
Ferguson, didn't
that's not-
Ferguson, I was gonna say, didn't we learn that lesson in Ferguson, Missouri? Where the federal government's final report on that was, yes, the officer was justified, but if you don't put the story out and put the information out, then the media and the public will come up with their version of what happened.
Yeah. Now, of course, Ferguson was kind of a unique situation. There were witnesses that needed to be vetted.
They need to be vetted. Yeah.
And we understand that. It was kind of a perfect storm where the lie caught wings and made it around the world. What was Hillary Clinton's old line about, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on? That's exactly what happened in Ferguson. By the way, I think she stole that from somebody else. It's an old line. I love it when Hillary used it.
but I do think, Kevin and Doug, I think that we've talked about this numerous times. I do think that there is a bridge that we could gap, right, by the transparency and also having some consistency, right? And so, like I said, I think just to wrap up this conversation, I think with the duty to intervene, if we can get some consistency and some transparency in internal policies, how the process works, if there is like a discussion about what's going to happen once something happens, it doesn't need to be with the whole media, but as long as it's with at least a family of the victims, I think that helps out a lot. And I think that shows that we're not trying to hide anything. This is going to be an open investigation, transparent. I think it works for both the law enforcement department and also the public, right? Because then we know that our law enforcement is not against us. They are working with us and they are very open and transparent to letting us know what's going on within that office. Like I said, a lot of times it gets confusing because you see internal policies, but they're not carried out consistently. And then at the end of the day, like we talked about last week, you have some employees that have been employed for a long time that might have been trained one way. And the longer they're there, they start to develop their own shortcuts or their own way. So it may not necessarily be a reflection on that particular law enforcement. It may have been someone that's rogue, but as long as that's being addressed, and you can see those policies and you have the ability to learn, which I want to say that you do have the ability to see those policies if you talk with the officers and the police department. I know that they let us get a copy of all of their internal policies without any kind of problem at all. And we were able to look through some of those and make suggestions. And we got a new police chief that's coming in, and he's already been very receptive to sitting down and talking with leaders, and so I do advise for that particular aspect to look at what we can do from the administrative process, maybe before getting to the criminal process, because that's also going to clog up the courts. It's going to make things more difficult. And, I would hate for the family then to bear some of those costs too, because they lose. Or they have some of these representatives that come in and represent them and they lose. You will be hurt financially as well. So I think that pendulum can swing both ways, right?
Right.
Nikki,
I think you hit on.
you're in Fort Worth, right? You're in Fort Worth, right?
I am.
Y'all screwed up not taking Bainbridge for the
They did.
Oh, they screwed up big time. But good for us.
Okay, we'll see.
I think you hit on a very key
It really is awesome.
Nikki.
But our biggest issue that we're going to have is getting the public aware, because the sad part is no one's engaged outside of our groups. No one's engaged. They don't care to know the truth about law enforcement or policies or anything else related to that. They're going to hear the flavor of the day on the news, and then that's what they're going to run with. When in reality, the facts just don't bear out what everybody believes about us. We are transparent. There's not an agency out there that I can think of that's not transparent on their stuff. I mean, yeah, they may not put out the information as fast as we'd like, but that's because they're conducting an investigation. It takes time.
Well,
And so We've
I'm
got,
going to disagree with Doug. I think Doug lives in Houston and works in Houston, where they've got a different culture than a lot of our agencies do. And I think Nikki hit on a very important point. There's too many agencies out there where officers go through an academy and they are taught the latest techniques, the latest tactics, the latest statutes, the latest codes. And then they get on the streets and they're being trained by officers that have not gone back through the newest training, that have not been exposed to, that don't know that we've got new policies and new tactics and new techniques. And then when something does happen, I think department heads and city attorneys and county attorneys, they don't want that information getting out there, because guess what? Who's got the vicarious liability? Who stands to be sued for failure to supervise, failure to train? And I think that's a big problem is, Houston may be doing it great. DPS may be doing it great. Dallas may be doing it great. There's a lot of other cities and counties out here that are not doing it as well. And we need to drag them. We need to drag them in.
I agree with that, Kevin. I completely agree with that, except for one thing. In those agencies that you're talking about, they can be fired for no apparent reason at all. So all this, they don't have the protections. So yes.
I get it. But I'm talking about the cities protecting the cities, not protecting the officers. It's not that they cover it for bad cops. It's they're worried about their own, liability in a civil suit. And that's why they're not being transparent.
Oh, okay. I got you. Okay.
So there are competing interests.
Oh, absolutely.
Amongst the process. And so TCOL may be a way to at least close the gap, at least in uniformity. Because again, as you say, Kevin, is it about the money? It's always about the money. Yes, we care about life lost. Absolutely. We care about people not performing their public service duties within the bounds that are established. But more importantly, we're worried about Federal Reserve notes and how those are going to actually transfer from one to the next if in fact you are culpable and deemed to be responsible.
And I also think too, going back and training those officers, like we were talking about, on what that duty means, right? What they should look out for, things of that nature, so that they have a general understanding too of the internal policies, that there is a consequence if you don't do this, or this is how we deal with that. It's just like with anything else, right? And so making sure that they understand internally what that duty is and how, they need to carry out their duties, neglected duties, all of those different things, making sure that when you're doing that training, they're reminded, no matter how far removed they are from when they first started, that that's a continual ongoing training. And I think that goes back to the overall theme, even as we talked last week about qualified immunity. At the end of the day, there's that underlying target. And I remember when they first talked about more training, Dak Prescott was like, I want to provide more money to training. I was one of those ones that was, they aren't being trained. We need to give money elsewhere. But now, after we've had the opportunity to talk and to kind of go through some of these things, I do believe that there is a strong need for training, right? A lot of need for training, a lot of need for resources, funding for that training, right? And I think it's very critical, because these are the gaps that we're seeing that don't necessarily have to do with the policies, but they have to do with the fact that there's not training, or there's training, but they're not, it's been far removed. So I think training would be very helpful here.
It's also important to remember that training has a staffing component to it too. You can't pull officers off the streets to train them if you don't have enough officers to cover the streets during that time frame. So while it's so understaffed, it's very difficult to keep up not only is training the first thing that gets cut when the budget gets cut, it's also the first thing that gets cut when you're short staffed. You're so busy trying to deliver services that you don't have time to train.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Well, Kevin, and again, it's a perfect segue and an opportunity to switch gears. We had mentioned Governor Abbott in the State of the State this past week. He talks about the issue of what you hear of a buzzword of defund, and that is something that I don't think anyone has asked for, except possibly on the fringes. I know some cities have acted. However, that can be a way to have funds put forth to training. This is where I appreciate Fred, being part of this discussion, because there's a perspective of maybe basic law enforcement and keeping agencies in a kind of a tighter parameter situation, as opposed to providing other services. But again, Kevin, you've been in law enforcement. Clay, you've been in law enforcement. Doug, same way. Fred, how do you, even when money is provided, funding is there, how do you schedule the transfer of classroom training or hands-on training and maintain some semblance of doing your job as maintaining, that community presence? How do you do that?
Well, on my end, my agency is large enough where we have our own training division, and so there's, I guess, the planners of that decide what the training is going to look like on a year-to-year basis. But I mean, there are other issues that everybody's affected by. With just this last year with the pandemic, I mean, we're in the middle of an in-service year when COVID hit, and so we had to readjust from in-class training to Zoom and all sorts of different things. There are some things that we've learned that you can certainly Zoom over, but there's a lot of stuff that has to have hands-on training. I don't know about the other agencies and their training staffs, but ours is its own division.
What Clay is hands-on that you cannot compromise with something of a Zoom or that type of technology?
Arrest tactics, things of that nature. What you just saw in Minneapolis.
Tactical escalation training.
Firearms.
Yeah, we hadn't figured out how to Zoom firearms training yet.
Well, somebody tried to do the tactical police driving, but got in trouble.
So we're set up just like Houston, Austin, DPS, San Antonio, all have our own training divisions. And so all that is in-service training when it's outside the academy. So basically you go back to the academy for your core week, and if you have an update or something like that, then you're going through it. But it's all hands-on. What a lot of the core training has come to is where we're using Police One to go through the classroom stuff that you don't need to be present for, that's hands-on. And so that training is critical. I'll give you the best example: de-escalation. We've been teaching de-escalation for probably 12 years. I've been an instructor for it for many of those times. And I'm going to tell you, when we first did de-escalation, it pissed almost everybody off, because one of the first scenarios is you go into a room and you kind of fan out, and you got a guy with a knife. And before de-escalation, we made more of a challenge for him to drop that knife, and then we went into deadly force. Now we go into a challenge, a taser. You've got somebody with a taser, you've got somebody with a pistol or a rifle, whatever they're carrying, and then you try to talk them down as you moving back, and you move out of that room, but you secure that room so he can't hurt anybody else or hurt him. You're trying to keep your distance more than you were before. And so that training took a while. It's like an evolution. So all the officers have to be retrained how they were trained before. It's no different than we started shooting with our John Wayne style shooting technique, and then we've moved to a straight up front to keep our gear flat, so we can use those panels to take the hits. So all that's an evolution. And so this duty to intervene will be another evolution of showing officers, when you have a situation like George Floyd, or you have a situation where we had a situation here in Dallas where we had officers on top of a guy in the median for too long, that we should have had a situation where it clicked, and it should, okay, let's just get him up. We know that he's in not great shape. We know that this is the situation. we still got to get him up and try to get him some assistance. And it's not that they weren't trying to get him some assistance, but they just weren't using the training thoughts weren't there yet. And that's retraining our officers is always going to be something we have to do, because we've always been trained one way. It's no different than getting a different gun that you started with academy and then you've moved to a different caliber and a whole different setup. So that evolution has to happen. Now, I have a theory, and I don't know if it's very practical to some, but some of these agencies, smaller agencies like TMPA holds the key to. TMPA goes out and trains a lot of these folks, and they help them update their training. And they do a very great job on that. But I'd like to see some of them that are within distance of miles, and I'd like to see the feds come in on this to give the money to it, is to send them to Houston if they're within certain miles. Send them to Dallas if they're within certain miles.
I said that, Fred. Said that, and I mentioned that to Doug. I think it was 2 weeks ago, if not last week.
Yeah.
Why
And
don't we
that's in the
collaborate?
commission report. That piece is in the commissioner's report, because the only way they can get trained is trained by officers that are doing the job already. It's
Right.
hard for them to just go send Frederick over to Dallas and train him, and then he'll come back and train us all. That whole scheduling and all that other crap. You get hurt, you have a kid, whatever, then you lose that gap all the way down. There's always an in-service training going on in Houston. There's always an in-service training going on in Dallas and all the cities I mentioned. And so I think that technique needs to be implied. But then again, that comes money. You're going to have the money to send them to go get it done.
And
That's what the problem
But that gets back to the heart of Steve's question. Steve's question was, when you do have the money, how do you accomplish this? And I think I would ask you guys, when was the last time DPS was fully funded and fully staffed? When was the last time Dallas Police Department was fully funded and fully staffed? How about Houston? When was the last time?
Good luck.
The answer to your question, Steve, is most of us don't know, because we haven't experienced that scenario yet. There are departments that do a wonderful job of rotating officers from whatever their designated assignment is back into their academies on a regular basis to get the newest training and so on and so forth. You look at Los Angeles PD, where they got 10,000 cops. They have a policy. They rotate through their academy. I think it's 1 month out of the year where they're back in there getting all the latest techniques, the latest training, and they're working with all the rookies. Houston doesn't have, I don't remember the last time Houston or Dallas or DPS had a staffing level that was sufficient to go to that degree. They can get them in and do their 40 hours. I don't know they can get them in there for 160 hours every year to get the latest stuff. I don't.
Well, TCOL's 40 hours every 2 years. Every cycle, every 2 years, it's 40 hours from TCOL. We do 32 per year. And we've actually had DPS at our facility training. We've had constables at our facility training. We offer our training to anybody that'll take it. That's not an issue. The issue comes into play is when we start having cadet classes and we're trying to schedule and juggle everything. That becomes the problem for us. But our department, we would love to train more. And again, it's just a budgetary issue and a manpower issue, because again, we're probably 2,000 to 3,000 people short. There's no way to make that up. We'll never make that up in my career time here.
I only did 38 years with the state, so I don't know when that happened. It didn't happen in my career. But we do have overtime.
There you go.
Yeah, even with all the troopers that they add, every time the state adds more troopers, it's because they've got some additional task they want to put on the troop. They want to send you to Dallas. They want to send you to the Valley, whatever. And even at that, a lot of the overtime is eaten up for those assignments too. It's not for training.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, if there is a central state agency as TCOL, maybe you divide up the state in regions and look to use the resources of the larger agencies, and then look to rotate. I like the fact that even if you can't get 160 in annually, at least if we can do what Doug's saying, if they do 32 annually, that does add up more so than 40 every 2 years. You're giving the smaller agencies something, and you may have to prioritize which training may be more essential for the times, the current times and before. But again, I think Frederick, Fred's right there. I'm right there with him. I'd rather send those smaller agencies to Dallas and Houston and those places to get something than rather just have us spin our wheels and say, well, we can't do anything. Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, y'all told us, which was new to me for sure, that some of these officers and law enforcement personnel are responsible for their own training. So if that's the case, if they can see that the larger agencies have spaces available that they can work them in, I'd rather have those smaller agencies getting on board with going to the larger agencies and getting some hours in than just doing something that's really not doing much more except getting a certificate and satisfying the fact that they sat and watched something on a video, because that's not going to be very helpful in real time.
Okay, Steve, think about this. Think about this. All you need to be a police officer, high school education, and pass the TCOL test. You don't even have to go through an academy for some of these agencies. Understand that. In fact, Kevin, how many people out there actually require you go through a outside academy class? As long as you pass TCOL and you have your high school education and you're 21 years of age, can you not hire on with a bunch of these agencies?
You don't have to have a high school diploma either. A GED suffices. We actually changed that statute back in the early 2000s, where it said because remember, you don't have to be able to read and write to pass a GED, because you can take because of ADA, you can take those tests orally. Even the TCOL exam can be taken orally. So we passed a statute back in the early 2000s that said if all you have is a GED, you also have to have either 12 hours of college or 2 years military with honorable discharge to go with it. It got repealed a couple of sessions later because the sheriff said it was cutting into their applicant pool. So we're back to just GED and a pulse is all it takes.
I'm telling you.
Does the citizenry, does the legislature recognize without the academy training? And again, y'all have said this, you put somebody out on the street that interacts with somebody, you're relying then on their home training, their environment, and their experiences up to 21 years of age.
The vast majority of agencies are hiring people that have gone through academies that are being put on by the local councils of government, by the local junior college, by the universities. They're not being put on by those agencies. Houston, Dallas, Austin, DPS all have their own in-house academy. Round Rock just now got their own. Round Rock up until now has been having to rely on somebody else's basic law enforcement academy.
But again, can we not see the disparity? That's like saying, hey, I'm going to get you trained for a sport by, these guys' dads who are big football fans. Whereas everyone else is coming to guys that may have been like, hey, Vince Young, Steve Foster, Sloan Thomas, other guys, that have Quan Cosby, that have played in the college level and have excelled. And now you take those persons of youth that have gone through our football academy versus some dads that are good guys that can talk the talk, but have never been out there in front of 80,000 people. There's a huge difference in what you get trained and what's important to people that want to play that sport. It's apples and hand grenades, gentlemen.
Well, I think the answer you will hear there is, but aren't they all teaching the same curriculum? Let's look at law schools. You guys all went to different law schools, right?
Right.
But you got taught the same material.
But they're accredited, which means they have a certain level.
Keyword right there.
All these police academies are accredited by the state of Texas. TCOL has to give them an academy
correct
number for them to teach.
Do the junior colleges and all of them, are they accredited just as well?
Yeah, they have to be accredited by TCOL. The difference is the curriculum isn't necessarily the same. It may be when you're talking about the book material, but
Right.
when you're talking about those hands-on techniques that we're talking about, there's a
Correct.
wealth of difference going on out there. So
Right.
But I would say this with law schools, though, we all still have like that first year requirements. I think those are all pretty similar. And then on top of that, even though we may not all learn the same techniques, I think law school is one of the only places where you can go and actually not know what you're doing when you graduate. Because really what it does is it changes the way, I'm honest. I mean, a lot of us went to law school when we graduated. You get that call from a family member, hey, can you come get me out of jail? I don't know the first thing about what I'm doing. You get experience through doing practical things. And Steve and Rudy, I know I'm not lying, but but you get the experience through practical. I interned at the public defender's office, at the DA's office, at the Department of Labor, so that I could actually learn. All law school did was teach me the principles and the fundamentals of thinking.
And I took criminal clinic so that I could actually practice
Exactly.
under a licensed attorney, so that I knew how to have a decorum in the courtroom, knew how to look at, a defendant and these things. Again, you can tell someone when the ball snapped, run out here and do this. But if you have somebody holding you up, you may not know how to get into your route. There are things that Quan Cosby, Steve Foster, Vince Young can teach you how to get just to get into the play that maybe a dad has never experienced. Even though you're talking about accreditation, that's the book. But yeah, you can have a football book, but there's some things that I show you that we can give you as techniques that are going to be very different than the average bear.
Mm-hmm.
So Steve, along those lines, I was just gonna, I'm sorry, and thank you. I'm sorry that just dropped in on this. Actually, this is an interesting point to drop in because this is something I've been thinking about. You're right, Kevin, when you're talking about law schools, and we were talking about, you essentially, there's some baselines. Nikki's right. Like, your first year classes, your 1L classes, your bar prep classes, you're going to know that.
Mm-hmm.
You're also right, Steve and Nikki, when they're talking about pragmatically speaking, how you execute that. I took juvenile justice clinic. I learned a lot about practicing law from that as well. Clerking at, civil law firms, civil litigation law firms. I learned, this is what discovery is, everything else there. But that stuff wasn't taught in law school. That
Correct.
Stuff was, outside of, the clinic. If I didn't take the clinic, if I didn't actually take the clinic to learn how to do that, I wouldn't have known how to do that coming out from there. And something that I thought about with me, and tell me if I'm wrong here or thought about that. Have we ever thought about partnering with Texas State or Texas A&M and having some sort of, I don't know, either degree plan, academy, something along those lines? I mean, I don't know what it would be exactly, but have something that's like, listen, they look at these issues all the time. They will be a partner with it. They'll help facilitate, train all these other things with it. And you're able to use university resources. Of course, I'm a Longhorn, so I'll tell you to go ahead and come to, Texas to go ahead and do that. but at the same time, maybe that's a solution where, I could be wrong. Maybe you guys are already doing that, but I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, how can we get this where from an academic standpoint, why don't we leverage those resources from academia? Just like Steve said, what a VY, what a Quan, what a Pat Mahomes, Tom Brady, I can teach you, if we can have someone doing that. And maybe that's the role that TCOL is going to, ultimately fill under a new revamped TCOL. But I also think that if we actually have university dollars flowing in annually on this training and trying to do some of these things, maybe that's a partnership or a deal we should look at.
There are things like that going on. Sam Houston State has a number of those initiatives. Texas A&M has TEACS, the extension that teaches a lot of law enforcement, but it's all optional. It's all voluntary. None of it's mandated for any particular agency. And by the way, what you guys are talking about, the correlation in law enforcement is you get through the academy, and we hope you have learned enough to stay alive while you go out and go through your field training program, and not to get your FTO killed in the process. And again, the FTO program varies enormously from one agency to another. That hands-on training, we got a little town up northwest of here a couple of months ago. They hired a new chief of police who is 90 days out of the academy. Now, where do you think his field training program was? He hasn't had one. He's going to give himself a field training program at a department where he's the chief of police.
Well, the problem becomes if there's an escalated situation, he doesn't know or she wouldn't know how to act. You know, this isn't Mayberry, and we can't all smile and laugh and have, you know, things wind up well at the end of an
Better
hour.
explain the reference. Most of our audience doesn't know what.
Yeah, I was about to say, Steve, but let me take it from another angle, Councilman Mateo angle, Kevin. Okay, so then you hire a city manager, who in turn is required to hire a police chief. What would go into a city manager's mind to hire somebody that young for that? If you're for a police chief, is it a money issue? Is
General
it
law city, they don't have a city manager. These little general law cities are run by their elected mayors.
So it's the politicians who are making the decisions. All okay.
Well, the issue becomes somebody driving through that small town getting stopped, and then there's nothing that says there's anything different except two people, one that says I have a badge and one that gets stopped who's a citizen. You don't know what the heck the fact pattern is going to look like.
Think back to Tulia. Steve, you were in the legislature when we were going through all the aftermath of what happened in Tulia.
Right.
So, I mean, and that's, I mean, Kevin, I mean, even hearing that from me, man, that's just, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. I'm thinking to myself, that's the stuff where the public doesn't, right? I mean, you've got to understand as an elected official, or you just got to understand as a person, hey, listen, what does that say to the public? What kind of confidence will the public have with this? And then least of which, I mean, how do we make sure that things like that don't happen in the future? Is it that we just make requirements regarding X number of miles for that? Because at the same time, there's, as you know, as Clay put it best with me, what is it, 2,783 different law enforcement agencies across the state of Texas. You're not going to, just from a financial standpoint, I hate to say it this way, I hate to bring it back to money, but just being honest with you, you're not going to find folks who are going to be wanting to live in Mayberry, ADP, or whatever you said, Steve, you know, these certain areas. So you're just going to have to try to get who you can, but we also can't just have who we can in these positions, because of just how important these positions are.
Right, because that adversely affects the citizenry and how people interact. And that's the difference. I mean, we've seen just the interaction between us as groups and as individuals takes on a very different perspective when you take the time out to do that. We don't have that for 2,700 agencies. We may have someone from El Paso driving through a small town that has 10 or less people with a 90-day chief of police. They say I'm speeding, and the next thing you know, there's an ABC News group because everything just didn't go the way it should have.
So as you can see, I mean, you know, a one-size-fits-all kind of solution is going to be extremely problematic and extremely difficult. And I think that's what we're going through right now with all the different bills that have been filed. They all attempt to address it from a narrow perspective, and it needs to be a much more, and I do agree that this sunset provision, that what T-Cole is going to go through over the next 2 years, this is the opportunity. This is the time where we have a chance to really make some strides. We're not going to, it's not going to get done in 2 years, and it's not going to get done in 10 years. This has to be a continuing, ongoing, ever-present operation.
Yep. Let me just ask Rudy real quick. Rudy, how do y'all train your officers there in Pflugerville? Do they have their own academy? Do they go to a local college academy? What do they do?
Yeah, you know, so we have our training with us, but we also have an academy that we send our folks to. And so, you know, if you have folks in an academy, I mean, my idea is that, hey, listen, that's the right way to do it, because you're able to go ahead and get that wealth of information, be around folks, understand that.
Let me clarify, Rudy.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Doug, you got to be able to afford that.
I want to clarify, the city of Pflugerville does not have its own basic police academy. You've got a training agreement where you do in-service training, but if you hire an officer, you hire a brand new cadet, one that has not been licensed yet. Y'all send them probably to the Central Texas Council of Governments Academy, right?
Send them off.
Yeah, you send them somewhere else to get them to the basic academy. So there's no coordination to speak of between what the academy is teaching them and what their field training officers, Because generally, a department like Pflugerville, they're going to go through at least 3 FTOs during their training program. But there's really no coordination between what they're being taught in the academy and what they're being taught in the field training program.
And you got to be able to afford the academy, and you got to be able to afford to work. I mean, and that's where I'm thinking more and more about from the financial aspect. You have me thinking exactly about that aspect, because it's like, hey, wait a minute, how if you don't have whatever we do, if we don't have a true fiscal note financial aspect given to cities to help effectuate these policies and these changes, it won't work, because they just can't afford. I mean, we're lucky, we're blessed, but we've grown as Kevin and y'all know, we grew like weeds. Like we grew out of nowhere. We're okay. Listen, now we have a tax base, we can afford that.
Funding is not a good plan.
Steve, let me point this out too. Pflugerville will still hire people that are not yet licensed and then pay them a salary while they send them to an academy and pay for the academy. There's a lot of agencies that won't do that anymore. They will say you have to already be licensed as a peace officer. And by the way, years past, in order to get into an academy, you had to be sponsored by the head of a law enforcement agency somewhere. A chief or a sheriff or a constable had to sign off and say, yeah, even though they had no intention of hiring the individual once they got through the academy, they would say, yeah, I've at least done a rudimentary background on this individual, and I'm going to sponsor them to go to the basic police academy. We don't require that anymore either.
Do you think that's something that we should go back to requiring?
Yes. I think we've got a whole bunch of people who go pay their way through a police academy, and there's too much of a profit margin in it for these junior colleges and COGS and stuff. And as long as it's the profit margin that's driving it and not the product that is driving it, I think we're flirting with danger.
And it's the other part of that though is there are a lot of agencies that aren't even going to look at you unless you have a basic TCOL certificate. So in order to get hired by somebody, they'll put themselves through that academy so that they got the piece of paper, then they can go to that agency and get hired.
Well, it's a lot of moving pieces, and I think,
and
I was going to say defunding, taking resources away from basic training opportunities for 2,700 agencies that are varied. You need more uniformity, and you don't need to take the funding away, because that basically takes the legs out from under having the knowledge and the wherewithal to deal with the citizens in a proper way, and I think even for Fred that wants basic law enforcement duties, they still have to be trained properly. If not, what difference does it make if they have 3 responsibilities or 6? They're not being trained in a way that's going to support what cities and council members expect, or what the public can really rely on and count on to have proper interaction.
Kevin, that will stay with me. Your illustration of that police chief, that's a discussion that I think that we need to have. Honestly, TML.
I'll bet that police chief has a patrol car and a radar as well, and a city limit sign on a very busy highway that is incorporated.
It drops down to 55 real quick.
So guys, real quick, and I know we're at 11 o'clock. Where, and maybe we can carry on this conversation next week, but where do we start with the funding? I know that the people are saying don't defund, but we need to talk about funding, period. Where do we start with respect to asking for those funds to be allocated so that we can do some of these things that we're talking about? Is that the state? Is that local? On the local level? Like where do we start?
Nikki, we don't have money. I'm telling you, 3.5% revenue.
Are you sure?
We asked for a car. We have people who are watching that are in the legislature. We asked for a carve out for fire and EMS and for police. That would make a big difference, because policing makes up almost 50% of all our budgets, no matter whatever entity you are. Right there makes about 50%. If we had a carve out for that, you would have a very different conversation at the local level. But we're trying to figure out stuff now.
You'd have better training.
we find a way to fund political campaigns in billions and billions and billions of dollars in this country. I know people that spend $1 million to run for the Texas House of Representatives. Why can't we find a way where our communities, our governments, our law enforcement agencies, we all somehow or another, we all cooperate on making sure we're raising these money. I think we could spend that money a lot better.
I agree with Kevin. I agree with Kevin. That's why I'm saying it has to start somewhere. And I think that you know, with these loud cries for defund, we need to be maybe talking about, let's find the funding. So we can get some, let's change the narrative, because I think that it takes away from what we need to do. And there's a lot of there's a lot of good law enforcement officers. There's a lot of good community leaders that all are striving for the same thing, right? And so I think a common ground definitely has to be met, because I agree with Kevin. If we campaign and we can do it for all this other stuff, maybe if we all universally raise our voices for this one issue, then they can hear us.
Right, because there's been a lot on the defund, but nobody's talking about the flip side that we have examined and definitely know would allow for less of these scenarios. But again, the clamoring and the kind of excitement of this instance seems to rule the day. And that's another reason why you want to get a transparent story out quicker. So we've looked at some things. We can continue this next week. I think it's imperative, especially given the fact that the governor of the state of Texas has made it a top 5 priority and is willing to take on this issue in the first 60 days of the legislative session.
I want to mention this. Dallas Police Association, Houston Police Officers Union, the Department of Public Safety Officers Association, and TMPA all spend a lot of our private funds. We are nonprofit corporations. We spend a lot of our funding on training for officers. It's very limited. We don't have a lot of funds to do this, but we spend a lot of our time and effort on trying to get better and more training for our law enforcement officers. So it's not like we're calling on other people to do what we're not willing to do ourselves.
Right. No, I agree.
Excellent. Well, certainly appreciate the time. Fred, it's great to see you back in the mix. And I know you have some thoughts about the parameters of what law enforcement does. Nonetheless, we all appreciate having you part of the conversation, and certainly looking for ways for better training to have a better result with the community. But there's so much information that is available that I don't think people know exist. And through these months, several months, we are finding out there are things that are already in existence that the general public and even lawyers don't recognize that are already existing in the world of law enforcement.
Fredo's made me hungry, so I got to go eat something.
No, I went to work at 4, so I started my day at 4. But you hit it on the head, Steve. I know everybody's going to go. The training is the biggest issue. It's been the training. We just don't have enough of it, and we don't have enough time. Everybody is stretched so thin that they're basically, hey, here's your stuff. Go to work. I'm gonna say something. Our last police chief that came in here, Chief Hall, and I don't like to dog people out, but it took her over 4 months to get her state training done. And she was on the job, not in uniform, for all those months leading up to a lot of different things that were happening on our department. This is a big department that's moving fast. Our new police chief started today, Eddie Garcia. He not only went and got his TCOL done before he started, he went and did his firearm training as well before he started. So today, 1, he's TCOL trained and firearm trained, and he's passed every single thing, and he's getting ready to get sworn in uniform. That's a hard accomplishment for somebody coming from a different agency like he did 30 years at San Jose, and he's worked every facet of the department. But that shows you the difference between some of these chiefs and some of these other chiefs. Some think they're coming to Hollywood, and some think they're coming to work. And we all know what I'm talking about. Houston has a problem there a little bit too. So
no
way.
And so that's the deal, but because they think the flash is it and not the substance. So we need to, that's one thing that kind of goes, it starts downhill. It's something, we don't work from the bottom up a lot of times. We work from the top down, and that's some of the problem with policing in America. It's policing all over the world.
Professionalism. You cannot make an organization professional from the bottom up. It cannot be done ever, anywhere. It's got to come from the top.
Well, we appreciate it. Thank y'all. We will be back next Wednesday. This really, I think, has provided the foundation for things that Councilmember Mateo and Kevin and Doug are doing outside of these discussions on Wednesday. I can attest to the fact that they are meeting multiple times and collaborating with our elected officials in the state of Texas, bringing these thoughts and ideas to the table and to legislative staff regarding these conversations and the information being discovered and researched. So this process is working for the state of Texas, and I'm very excited to see where it goes during this time that we have up to June 2021.
Hey, I will be in Austin Monday, so we can try to set something up Monday afternoon. They would do dinner for everybody that's going to be there Monday for the session on Tuesday.
Thank you.
He's saying that to everybody who's listening too. So it's all on Doug.
Come on down. Come on down. We'll take care of it.
You better bring that black credit card, not that regular credit card, if you're telling everybody.
Oh, I've got one with my name on it. That's all I got. So we ain't getting too far. But I'll send out for everybody.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all so much for the discussion today. We'll
I
catch
got
you
it.
next.
Good one. Okay.
Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Until next week.